You've spent 20 minutes grinding your way to the endgame in Warzone, only for the final circle to be completely in the open and screw you out of a win. Sound familiar? Well, let it happen no more. Chow down on some tips to get the advantage in these endgame scenarios and increase your chances of winning. I'm going to go through a bunch of different aspects which you can use and improve upon to help you in these open final circles, as well as show a couple of clips where people are in the endgame and make both good decisions and bad mistakes. Such as this clip of me being an idiot and messing around only to be cut down. Aww. Or even this clip. Are they up on the hill? Balls. Before we even go into the game, there are things we can do to improve our chances of winning if the final circle goes into open ground where there's little to no cover. For example, your choice of operator and their skin or camo will have an influence. With so many skins available now, I admit, it is fun to use different ones that look cool, like this gold-coated Youre one. But let's face it, it's not what we'd call camouflage, is it? If you're trying to keep a low profile out in the middle of nowhere, it's not gonna happen. Whereas if you were to choose a Kruger or Otter skin or something like that, the opposition could easily overlook your location and not even spot you. In addition to this, your loadout can have an effect. I always recommend people run Ghost to avoid being spotted on UAVs and heartbeat sensors, and the same applies here. You don't want to give away your location when there's hardly any cover. You could always run Cold-Blooded in this scenario too, in an attempt to avoid being spotted on thermal scopes when you're amongst the backdrop of the map. On that point, it's sometimes worth having a thermal attachment on your weapon and running smokes, especially when you're not playing solos, as your teammates can run the heartbeat sensor and stuns. Throwing a smoke down to cover lines of sight when it's time to move and being able to see through it is a massive advantage in open final circles. But of course, thermal scopes aren't extremely popular due to their slow aiming down sight speeds, but it's something to consider for sure. So we've got our pre-game loadout option sorted in case the endgame comes to this. But what about when you're actually there? Well, my first couple of hints aren't going to be that surprising to you, but they're useful all the same. Firstly, I advise to stay low and to find specks of cover where you can. Even in open areas, there's usually something to get behind like rocks and mounds and things like that. Secondly, where possible, try to stay on the peripheries of the circle. There's just less lines of sight you can be seen from, and you can't be shot from behind. So after you stick to basics like this, I advise to try and work with the circle, which admittedly isn't always that easy, as luck plays a role when the final circles can push you out of cover to the other side of the circle. But when you see that the circle is going to be pushing you out of cover, there are a few things you need to assess. Can you move reasonably safely to more limited cover? If so, make a dive for it after checking it's safe. If not, you need to decide when and how you're going to be taking on gunfights, and then, most importantly, commit to it. For example, usually by this point there aren't many people left in the game at all. Often it's actually like a 1v1 scenario. If you know their location, or even rough location, you can make a final stand. It's much better to go out on a gunfight rather than running for cover. Another thing you can assess at this point is whether you have a gas mask or not. If you do, weigh up whether it's worth staying still for a moment or two whilst the circle moves and the gas engulfs you, so you can stay concealed and get shots off at the enemy as they are forced out. My next key tip is to not shoot unless you have to when it's more than your team versus one other team. Ideally, you want the enemies to fight off between each other, giving away their location and weakening each other for you to third party it. This takes some trigger discipline, no doubt, as sometimes it's so tempting to take the kill when it would just be so easy, but you've got to be thinking of that number one spot. So we've positioned ourselves as well as we can do, but what else can we do when we're in those positions to increase the likelihood of us winning? Well, you want to make sure that you make use of your equipment. As mentioned earlier, smokes and thermals would be great, but aren't necessarily massively useful in the rest of the game to get you to that endgame scenario. Stuns and flashes and semtexes are great to have as they can help you find information on your opponents, and of course kill them, C4 is the most popular equipment choice, but it's actually less useful in this endgame when there's no cover, since you can't throw it far and quickly. If you do end up with some good equipment left at this stage of the game, it's important to not just throw these items randomly, as you could just end up giving away your position. They're great to use to narrow down potential places where people are likely to be. For example, if there's hardly any cover, then you can pretty much figure out roughly where people can be, you can stun it and check if they're there or not, and then if they're not there, they're likely the other place you suspect. Next up, a quick note on field upgrades. If you've done some recons, or can clearly see that the final circle is potentially going to be out in the open, you can try and prepare for it before you even get there. For example, if you get a deployable cover for this endgame, all of a sudden, you're actually favourite to win the endgame. Finally, there's kill streaks. Now it's always a good idea to keep some back for the endgame, whatever environment you find yourself in, but it's even more important for final circles in the open. If you have a cluster strike or precision airstrike to hand, you of course have the opportunity to kill someone, but most importantly, you can flush them out since a warning sign will come up on their screen when you call one in near them. When they're on the move, you can knock them down and take that win. Hopefully these tips have been helpful to you and increase your chances of winning next time you find yourself in the endgame with little to no cover. But that's all from me in this video. Please give it a like if you have a second, and why not consider subscribing if you haven't already for more Call of Duty videos. See ya!